Well, good morning if you are in California. Good afternoon if you are on the East Coast of the United States, including New York City, where my guest is today. Good evening to people in Europe and Africa. Greetings overnight to people all around the world. Special love to those of you who are dealing with adversity of any kind. We're with you. We hope that music can help support you. I'm Fred Plotkin. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Idagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Idagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. And I always like on this show to have people who inspire me. The gentleman I have today is a conductor, Richard Cordova, or Cordova. How do you prefer it?
The second way.
The second way, I know, but I always like to ask, who is a conductor and a whole lot more. He's a very respected person in our field, someone I've known probably for a very long time. I see your back a lot, a lot more than I see your front because you're a conductor. And you have carved a path that's a very interesting path that combines what we might call standard repertory with unusual repertory.
Yes.
And you are equally adept at both and an advocate not only for contemporary opera, important though that is, but also works from the past that may not be known, that you help bring to the fore. So, Richard, welcome. I'm trying to think where to begin. I think I know. Last December 2nd, was the 100th anniversary of the birth of Maria Callas. And viewers know that I did a 5-part series on Callas. I don't claim to be an expert, but I am somewhat immersed in her life and work, as any opera lover is. And there was a gathering on her birthday at an all-day event sponsored by Teatro Nuovo and other people. And there was an audience game, and I'm not a competitive type. I just don't like competing. I did enter the contest, and I looked all around the room full of very smart, knowledgeable opera people. And I didn't ask myself who might win. I had sort of an inside pony, and I imagine she came in very well. But the winner of the most expertise about all of the arcane and not so arcane stuff of the life and career of Maria Callas was you, Richard. Did that surprise you?
Not entirely. I went into it saying, I think I can win this. I actually did. I was set back a little bit when I saw there was going to be a very formidable team of the dramaturg Corey Ellison teaming
That
up.
was my pony.
Yeah, and she teamed up with the critic David Schengold, and between the two of them, they have a wealth of knowledge. And I thought, well, that's pretty stiff competition. But
also, I didn't think it was fair that some people formed teams. Had you and I formed a team, I would have piggybacked on your knowledge. But nonetheless, there were a couple of answers I knew that most other people didn't know, and those were sort of worked in my favor, about repertory that she sang in Greece before she began her Italian and European career. That stuff I really happened to know, and maybe not everybody did. Did you?
Most everything I knew. There were a couple questions that stumped me, and one of them that surprisingly stumped me, when they had the round where they had you identify the pieces and what she was singing. The last excerpt I couldn't get, and surprisingly, it was from the opera Dinora, which I've conducted.
Yes, I know that.
But,
one of the many works where I've seen your back.
But I forgave myself afterwards because I realized that the excerpt that Will Crutchfield played is a recitative from the Italian version. And when I did it, we did the opera comique version with spoken dialogue. So that particular recitative, I did not know. So that was new to me. So I say, well, I forgive myself for not knowing that particular excerpt was from Dinora, because that portion of music I had never encountered before.
So the obvious question is, I mean, yes, we opera lovers all immersed in Maria Callas, but how come you obviously knew so much?
Um, been a favorite of mine for decades, and I'm not sure. I just would uh, read various books, and a lot of the information, be it important or trivial, has sort of stuck in my brain. Um, Sometimes I surprise myself because I can remember things from many, many years ago. I can remember casts I saw 40 years ago in a performance, and something like that just, for whatever reason, sticks with me. And so there was just a lot of information about her that has been with me always.
And this brings to mind what is a serious question, even if it sounds cheeky. Um, I've only met one dumb conductor my whole life. All the other, and it's not you, all the other conductors I've met have been really smart and have superb memories. And the dumb conductor, although he did conduct at the Met and other places, really doesn't have much of a career now. I don't know what happened to him, but and I'm not naming him and I'm not faulting him, but he just didn't seem to have it. And I never quite knew how he got to the Met, only for one production and of Bohème, and then they quickly kind of showed him the door. Um, and he's not doesn't seem to be conducting anywhere. But what is it about the conductor's brain? Does it get developed that way, or do you have to have a really good memory and be smart to even undertake conducting?
Um, I think you have to have a knowledge about a lot of different things and be able to process it in a very organized way. There's so much that happens at any given moment in a performance, and you have to be able to think quickly on your feet. But there's just a lot in study work than people imagine that goes into this. I still surprise myself because I find that, why didn't I think of that earlier? When I say earlier, why didn't I think of that 30 years ago? It just is, it's a process that never ends, and there's just, as I say, a lot of things that have to be digested and processed in an organized way. I don't know if that answers your question
It
or
does,
not quite.
but I think I'm going to go on the assumption that, with the one exception, the guy I was referring to, that all of you happen to be blessed with great memories and a lot of cells to store this information. But I think what I'm interested in knowing too is how it gets stored, how it gets saved, and how you as a conductor summon what you need in a particular moment. That sounds like a very broad question. Let's be very precise. Let's say that you have conducted Tosca numerous times, as I imagine you have, and you know the work, but you're working on a different production in a different theater with different singers. What do you bring from your previous knowledge of Tosca, and what do you have to make new in the production of Tosca in front of you?
Well, I at least start out by knowing where the dangerous spots are, and I try to make sure that I have talked through and rehearse it in a way that the singer and I are on the same page. We know what each of us want. I will be doing this, you will be doing that, or vice versa. And I just try to, if I've done a work many times, I try to zero in on those particular spots that I know could potentially be problematic based on past experiences I've had. You probably know that the piece I've done the very most of any has been Porgy and Bess.
Yes.
I did many European tours of that and have done it hundreds of times. And I feel like that experience helped me learn how to do this, because I sometimes would have different casts on succeeding nights. We had multiple casts, sometimes covers went on. And I like to joke, people say, well, where did you actually learn to conduct? And my joke is, I said the Catfish Row Conservatory. Because doing it so many times, doing the piece so many times, there were chances to experiment. I said that tempo transition or that particular moment didn't go right yesterday. Why didn't it go? Well, let me try it a different way today. And I had that opportunity. Sometimes we're in very obscure, out of the way places. It maybe wouldn't matter as much as if we were at, Berlin or Dresden or something. And I had a chance to try it a different way. And in this way, I actually broadened my technical vocabulary as a conductor. And that experience was so invaluable for me to really learn and understand things on a deeper level.
Now, the opera, which I can certainly consider an opera and a masterpiece, is from the story is from the 1920s, the play and the book, which was just called Porgy by DuBose Hayward, which evolved into Porgy and Bess, and was created in the mid-1930s by George and Ira Gershwin and DuBose Hayward, and had from the beginning Black casts. I say Black as opposed to African American because not everybody was American.
Right.
Many of our Black colleagues would say persons of African descent, and that's a better term. But I'm using, back then the terminology often used was Negro. And, but the point is that the Gershwins wanted that Black people play the roles that were of Black people. The opera has been controversial through the years because some people have considered its dialogue, its patois, to be somewhat denigrating and racist. Others have said this is how people who were uneducated in South Carolina in the 1920s might have spoken. Within that are some very clever lyrics by Ira Gershwin, especially "It Ain't Necessarily So," which makes Sport and Life sound like he is Cole Porter. But it's also a work that has numerous versions. And in that there are pieces that are put in, kept out, and so on. Do you have a standard playing version that you prefer?
Well, if one is doing the opera, there really is only, well, I shouldn't say there is one version. We recently, a critical edition has been released. And the last time I was involved with the production of Porgy, which was 2 summers ago in Des Moines, they used the critical edition. And it was interesting because they're very small discrepancies, but I guess I can pat myself on the back for knowing the score well enough. I say, wait a minute, isn't that bass note usually a B natural? Why does it sound like C natural and things like that?
But also the piano, the Jasbo Brown part near the beginning has been used or not used. The most recent Metropolitan Opera version, if I recall, shortened that. The Broadway version with Audra McDonald significantly cut out certain parts of the opera.
Yes, the Broadway version is kind of a different beast entirely.
Yeah.
I went and saw that, and while I appreciated some of the additions to it dramatically, I didn't like the way they played around with the music. I felt like they created a language that was not Gershwin's musically, and I didn't mind the fact that yes, some of the numbers were transposed, but if Audra McDonald is going to sing Bess 8 times a week,
let her do what Audra can do whatever Audra wants to do.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
fine with that. She's a great artist.
So I don't mind the key transmission. What I minded were sometimes the rhythmic language that was underneath was too contemporary. It did not sound period and sounded like it was a version of it rather than the piece itself.
Right. I minded that they condensed some of the characters so that the great Mariah, who's sort of the secular head of the town, as opposed to Serena, who's the spiritual head of the town, Mariah also became the lawyer and sold the divorce. Why? I guess to save one character. But that just didn't, if you know and love this work as I do, and certainly you do, it just stands out. Like, why did you not bring someone from the chorus just to play the lawyer for 3 minutes? It's such a rich work.
I was very lucky. I got to actually meet Anne Brown, the singer who actually was the very first Bess. Yes, on one of our European tours, we played in Oslo, Norway, which is where she was living.
Yes.
And not only did she attend a performance, but a luncheon was arranged, and several people from the cast, and myself included, were able to go to the luncheon. And so I was able to ask her a few questions.
Mm-hmm. What did you ask her?
Well, most importantly, I knew that as Gershwin had originally conceived it, Clara's big song, Summertime, in the original was not reprised by Bess. There was actually a wonderful duet in that spot where that Bess and the character Serena sing together called Lonely Boy, where they kind of reach an understanding and Serena finally accepts Bess. And it's kind of a wonderful piece of music. I actually was able to obtain a copy of it. It never was orchestrated by Gershwin, but I have it in my library, and it's sort of my long dream to someday do a production of Porgy where I have a sympathetic producer that would let me restore this duet. But to get back to my original story, I had to ask Anne Brown, why was this duet cut, and why did a reprise of Summertime get substituted in its place? And she says, it all happened because I continually harassed George Gershwin to give me this. And she said, I was incessant about this. I would not give him any peace. And finally, one morning, he came in and he said, well, Miss Brown, and he always had called her by her first name before that. Well, Miss Brown, you've got your wish. And that's when the reprise of Summertime first was instituted.
This is one of the reasons I love doing this program, is that I can talk to someone who spoke to someone who was the original creator of a role going back to the 1930s, and we can document that in 2024.
And the other last little thing that Anne Brown said, and I kid you not, she said, and contrary to popular belief, I did not have an affair with George Gershwin, but it wasn't for lack of trying.
Now, an issue that's come up lately with this opera that I have my feelings about, and I wonder yours, Porgy, the terminology of nowadays, words like cripple, handicapped, disabled, whatever term you want to use, some productions I've seen recently have minimized his disability. And I remember that the very first production I saw, my dad took me, I was 6 or 7, and it was the early 1960s. And it was at Brooklyn Academy of Music in Brooklyn. And my dad, who was a musician, knew all that music, loved it. He had seen it in the 1930s. And then the Leontine Price, William Warfield version in the 50s. And so he was all set for me to fall in love with this work. And I had never seen, perhaps in life, but certainly on a stage, a disabled person who was a hero, who, well, maybe you want to describe him. Is he accepting of his disability? Is he cheerful? Is he mournful? I just find the character of Porgy so fascinating and complex because he has his physical limitations. He has his intellectual lack of development. I won't say he's not intelligent, but he's not learned, or he's not literate, perhaps. But nonetheless is such a fully formed, magnificently empathic person, an empathetic person, that I fell in love with that character even more than Bess, because he struck me as being so noble, whatever a 7-year-old might have perceived as noble. And nowadays, when you see men playing Porgy who are sort of wearing leg braces or using a cane, it doesn't have the same impact for me as seeing a man who faces real challenges, physical challenges, and either lives with them, overcomes them. The stakes were much higher for me when Porgy was more disabled than the ones you see nowadays who have a leg brace and a cane.
Right.
What do you think about these modern interpretations?
Well, I know how they've come about. It's basically performers who have done the role many times say it does, going around on that little cart does take a toll on one's knees as a performer. And some of the older men who have done it say, I can't do it anymore on the cart. My knees can't handle that anymore. And I think that's how it came about, that they started to modify how his disability was actually physically seen. And I think maybe a little Pandora's box was open when they said, well, we can just show him with a cane or a crutch, or, and as you say, now it's just leg braces. And yes, it doesn't, to me, it doesn't have the same impact on an audience because he doesn't seem that disabled. And when he leaves at the end, you think, well, if he's on leg braces, maybe he actually could make his way to New York and find Bess. Whereas when he's on the cart, of course, it's a hopeless venture, and it's so much more poignant because of that.
When
But
he
I think,
says, I'm on my way, and the gates of Catfish Row open and out he goes, even when I was 6, I knew he was going to die, that he
yeah,
would never get to New York. I didn't have an optimism for him. And I was just so much, I'm getting goosebumps as I think about it, so much more moved and overwhelmed by the fact that he would make that sacrifice or have the faith or belief that this is what he had to do to find Bess again, who had been absconded to New York by sport and life, probably for life of prostitution and early death. And that I was so powerful and so adult for me, because the other operas I saw at the same time were Carmen and Bohème and the Magic Flute, works that you might take a kid to who you want to start him with opera. But those works affected me, but it was really Porgy and Bess that I thought this is what opera or the theater could be for a 7-year-old. And, bless my parents who understood that don't spare the child, let him see real life. But also, that being the early 60s, I saw people, men mostly, who were survivors of war, whether it was Second World War, Korean conflict, later Vietnam War. And then I moved to Europe pretty young, and I saw people in Austria and Germany and Italy, France to a lesser degree, and the UK, who were profoundly disfigured by war. And I'm not saying that Porgy was disfigured by war, but I saw people who lived with real life. In Italy, there would be institutions that were called per i disabili e gli invalidi. In other words, for the disabled and the invalids. And these were institutions that also i mutilati di guerra, in other words, those mutilated by war. And so these people were amongst us all the time. I remember my first time in Vienna, I was 19, and there were many people who were survivors of World War II, who were profoundly disfigured. And somehow, thankfully, nowadays we have better equipment and we have better, some ways, better care for people with disabilities. But I remember thinking that Porgy's struggle was so much more powerful because of the adversity he faced.
yeah,
And that a woman could love him for him. I don't know, for a 7-year-old, I'm not saying I was mature, but there was something about this work that I saw that Porgy could be loved for more than being tall and handsome or strong or whatever. And that a woman like Bess, who I didn't understand her yet, could love a man like that, that a man could be accepting of her when the other people in the community were rejecting Bess.
right.
All of it was incredibly human for me and very profound. And frankly, I lived in Brooklyn in a neighborhood with a lot of African Americans. I know it helped me bond with my Black neighbors and friends. And, that story and everything that went with it was profound.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you
It's
feel now that it's hard to produce because of the language, the stereotypes?
I I think it still will sell tickets.
Yeah.
Certainly, there still is an audience for it. Um, it there might be some people that think it's not really documenting the Black experience in an accurate way or in a way
Mhm.
that is um, socially acceptable anymore. But I think people know Gershwin's music. They know what he did, and I think there's still an audience for it. Now, that being said, I know that the Met did a production, the new production, not that long ago, and when they did it the second season, it didn't sell out. As far as I know, they were supposed to have done it this past season a third time, and they changed their minds on that, is what I had heard.
Well,
So,
it's also a very expensive show to produce. I worked on the production at the Met in the 1980s.
uh-huh.
Grace Bumbry, Simon Estes production, James
Yeah.
Levine conducting, the wonderful Barbara Conrad. I don't know if you ever
Oh,
dealt
yeah,
with her.
I did. I do.
We'll talk about Barbara in a moment. Then played Mariah. Um, what's her wonderful name? The woman who sang Serena. She was from Baltimore. I'll think
Florence
of her.
Florence Quivar? Was it Florence
No,
Quivar? No.
Florence sang another role. Um, I can picture her. Veronica Tyler.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
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 And it was a wonderful cast. And Greg
Yeah.
Baker was crowned.
Right.
And the energy, the fact that it was finally getting to the Met 60 years later, 50 years later, Levine really conducting very well. But it was a physical challenge because there's a lot of action in that production.
Yeah.
And I, as the performance manager, had to deal with the fact that there were numerous injuries that happened to the cast, especially to the Robins and the Jakes and the secondary characters. And I'm not being humorous here, but it's true. We had a real live goat, and the recent Met production did not have a goat.
No.
And that goat left things all over the stage,
Oh
let's
yeah.
put it that way, that people fell in, that
Yeah.
had injuries as a result of. Even the most tame goat, if he's not ready to leave the stage to go to New York, he's not going. So my question is, have you worked on productions with live goats?
No, neither in that opera nor Dinora, where the goat plays an important role also. No, as I say, much of what I did was a long-standing touring production in Europe, and it just would have been too
Right.
impractical.
To travel with a goat and a goat understudy.
Well, exactly. And there's one line at the end when he says, bring my goat."
Bring me my goat.
It's almost always been changed. Bring my cart.
I know.
Yeah.
But Simon Estes, there'll be the bink bink in the orchestra.
Yeah.
Bring me my goat.
Yeah.
I'm on my way. And then the chorus would swell. And again, I'm getting goosebumps. Was so gorgeous. And it was a good goat. And he did what he was supposed to do. But, we had some very serious injuries in that production because of falls and between the fight scenes and the goat droppings. It was a hard show to do.
Yeah.
I can speak, and I know you can too, to the fact that certain operas and plays are just fraught with challenges and injuries and so on. And you kind of dread them, and not because they're cursed, let's say La Forza del Destino or something like that, but Porgy and Bess is one of them. It's a real challenge.
Yeah.
Cavaliere Rusticana is another one. For me, in my experience, Der Rosenkavalier and the Tales of Hoffmann are impossibly hard to work as shows.
Sure.
Rosenkavalier because there's so much happening. Tales of Hoffmann because of the magic and the flames and the fires and all of that. It's a hard show.
Yeah.
But so unless there's something more you want to cover about Porgy and Bess, I'm going to pivot just a little bit to another opera you did. You may not remember that I was there. I've almost always been there. You just haven't seen me because you had your an opera I really love that I always, when I had James Levine's year, it was one of the operas I asked him to do, and he was always inclined to do it, but he said it would take too much rehearsal. Mithridate Re di Ponto by Mozart. Did you think I was going to say that one? No.
No, and I didn't know you were there.
Of course I was there. Because I happen to love that opera, and also because I did a lot of my training in early opera work in Milan, and it premiered in Milan when Mozart was 14.
Yeah.
And for many people, it was his first mature opera, even at the age of 14, and part of a trilogy of opera seria that goes with the Domeneo and La Clemenza di Tito, also works I adore. The Met has a beautiful production by Jean-Pierre Ponel that has the same frame for Idomeneo and La Clemenza di Tito. Certain drops, hangings are changed a bit, but it works for both. And I said to Levine, with even though poor Ponel had died, that with very little work we could make that frame work for Mitridate.
Yeah.
And he said, yes, but we would have to train the orchestra, the chorus, the soloist in the style of Mitridate, even though it has similarities to Idomeneo and somewhat to La Clemenza. What did he mean?
First of all, I wouldn't have to worry about the chorus because there actually is no chorus in that
Okay.
opera. So but the level of vocal virtuosity is something that's pretty hard to find these days. Mozart, the teenage Mozart wrote that for very, very specific people in Milan. He came to Milan, he worked out the scenario with the librettist and had all the recits written, hadn't written any of the musical numbers because they were all to be virtuoso arias tailored to the strengths of the particular singers who were working on it. Mm-hmm. And there was I've read some background about this. There was a lot of politics involved. There was a faction in Milan that resented an Austrian teenager coming in and writing. I believe it was one of the prime spots each season. It premiered on December 26th, the day after Christmas, which is when the carnival season began.
Yeah.
So it was a plum spot, and there was some resentment, and there were people that were trying to bring it down. Interestingly enough, one of his champions was the original soprano who sang Aspasia, the leading soprano role in the piece. She liked what she heard and insisted that he remain. She actually went to bat for him because they were trying to substitute arias from other composers. Apparently, the libretto for Mitridate had been around and may have been set by other composers prior to that. And as I say, there were people who wanted to substitute arias from other composers in place of Mozart's, but as I say, the singer who was Aspasia, fought very hard for his music to be kept.
Another composer whose works you've advocated for and produced a lot, and I'd like you also to talk about the composer in addition to the works, is Carlisle Floyd.
Oh, yeah.
Well known and loved to Americans who love opera, but not necessarily known abroad. If he's known, he's probably known for Susanna.
Right.
But you did Prince of Players, you did Markheim, which I didn't see, and Slow Dusk. Talk about these works. I don't know them, but I knew Carlisle Floyd a little bit.
Well, there's a whole treasure waiting to be mined, and I'm hoping 2 years from now, when we'll be celebrating Carlyle's centenary, that some of these works will be unearthed again. Yes, Susanna is done everywhere. It's second to Porgy and Bess, and actually Amal and the Night Visitors, the most performed American opera. Most of the other works are not done, of Mice and Men, Once in a Blue Moon, but the others are virtually unknown. And so I was really very grateful to get the opportunity to do these. Slow Dusk was his very first opera. I call it. It was Carlyle's Le Villi, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote
by
it when
Puccini,
he was by Puccini, right? He was in his early 20s, and like Wagner, he always wrote his own libretti. So he fashioned the story, and he was presented when he was a student for a while at Syracuse University. And it was actually presented there for the first time. It's very much a forerunner of Susanna. It's the same southern rural setting, the same musical language. And actually, I think for a first tryout, the score is quite good. What is less good is the libretto. The libretto is faulty, and there's not much of a plot. And what there is rather slim, but it was his first time. But surprisingly, the score, the musical language is remarkably sophisticated for someone who was in his early 20s. And I think it's a piece that should be done more. It's a 40-minute one act with only 4 characters. It's something that I think could be done by a school, a university. if they have particularly a good soprano for the lead, because she's got a big Shana at the end, which reminds me, some of the musical language, believe it or not, gets into something that sounds kind of like Madama Butterfly in Puccini, believe it or not. And so I think it's fairly easy to produce with only 4 characters, and I think it should be done more often. The piece that we paired it with, Markheim, I think is something of a masterpiece. It was written right in the middle of his career. It was the opera that immediately preceded Of Mice and Men in his canon, and was written specifically as a vehicle for Norman Treigle. Treigle was Carlisle Floyd's favorite bass baritone that did the role of Blitch, and so he wanted to write something very special
Blitch
for him.
and Susanna.
Thank you.
What I would call the Samuel Ramey roll it away.
Right.
But, yeah.
And so the piece was commissioned by New Orleans Opera and done there in the mid '60s. It's interesting because it's one of 2 or 3 operas that he wrote that are not set in the rural American South. It's actually set in Victorian London. It's based on a story of Robert Louis Stevenson, a short story. If people say, what's it about? I said, it's kind of a mashup of A Christmas Carol, Faust, and what's the third thing I said? The other famous story of Robert Louis Stevenson.
Robinson Crusoe?
No. Jekyll and Hyde.
Jekyll and Hyde.
It has it has elements of all 3.
Yeah.
Including a little bit of the supernatural thing. And I think it's something that's it's about 65, 70 minutes long. We paired it with Slow Dust, but it could actually stand on its own, as it did when it was first premiered in New Orleans. Incredibly involving, engaging. The characters are very vivid. You have, at the second half of the piece, you have a Mephisto character who appears out of nowhere. Interesting enough, sung by a very high tenor in this one, because Markheim himself was the bass role.
Yep.
And I'm hoping that piece will be done again on a more frequent basis.
Did you know Carlisle Floyd?
I met him in Des Moines. I was there one season when they were doing Susanna, and they decided to do, as sort of an ancillary project for the young artists, 2 one-acts, one of which was Markheim, and I was assigned to be music director for that. The other one was another piece he wrote called The Sojourner and Molly Sinclair, and a colleague of mine led that one. So I got to know the piece through that experience and got to meet him. A few years later, when I was still working at Sarasota Opera, they produced Of Mice and Men, and he came to that. So I got to spend time with him there. And when I became involved with the Little Opera Theater of New York here in town, I got Philip Schneiderman interested in the idea of doing his work. So he reached out to him, and I think it was right around that time that the biography that was written about him had been published, and there was a kind of a book signing and a presentation at Opera America in Carlisle. I was in time, and Philip went to that, and I think he met him on that occasion. And so, the gates were open, and we decided that Markheim was worth producing. And then we thought, well, it wouldn't stand on its own for a whole evening. What shall we pair it with? And then the idea came to do his very first opera, Slow Dust. So we did that 2014. And at that time, he was in the process of writing what turned out to be his final work, The Prince of Players. And Philip thought about it and said, we should go for it. We should try to get the rights and do the first New York performances of this before another group does it. So he was able to do that. And lo and behold, we were the second group that actually presented the piece anywhere.
And talk about Prince of Players.
Prince of Players is a fascinating work. It's based on a book and a movie. The movie had a different title. What was now it's escaping me what the title was. had a subject that was not set in the rural American South. This was set in Restoration England.
Mm-hmm.
The lead character, Kynaston, was an actor who specialized in playing female roles on stage.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
saw it,
Yep.
And it presented its own challenges, the piece, one of which was the baritone who sang the role of Kynaston. We weren't sure what sort of sound he should make at the beginning, because the very first scene, we see him on stage playing Desdemona in Othello. And the question was, well, should he be singing this in falsetto? What would be the solution? Ultimately, we came up with the idea, no, the falsetto itself would be distracting.
Yeah.
And probably end up being comical.
Yeah.
Unintentionally. So we just said, use a kind of half voice, a kind of marking voice to represent the female figure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's the way it's almost always been done, because most people have decided that, unless the person has a background also as an experienced countertenor, it's probably not going to sound that good in the falsetto.
True.
And so we decided this was the safer and easier way to go about having him do that opening scene.
Another opera that I saw that you did the New York premiere of is by Benjamin Britten, Owen Wingrave.
Yes.
Now, recently I had the British-based Brindley Sherrod on, and he's a great specialist in Benjamin Britten, and he is an Englishman from Northern England, spoke about the particular relationship that musicians, but people in general in the UK have with Benjamin Britten, and their understanding of his being representative of a certain kind of Englishness. England is such a complex place, we can't say there's only one kind. But I love the way Brindley Sherrod said that when you listen to certain of his works, you can smell the fish and chips. And Benjamin Britten did create a very profound vision of Englishness, whatever that is. Now, Owen Wingrave is probably a bit apart from that. Talk about this opera, and how is it that you undertook to give the New York premiere of it?
Well, it had been on, this is when I was involved with Little Opera Theater, and Philip Schneidman, had been on his wish list for a very long time. And we were astounded to find out that nobody thus far had ever actually produced the entire opera in New York. It had been done in the United States, mostly at universities, but none of the big schools in New York had ever done it complete, oddly enough. So strangely enough, in 2019, we were doing the New York premiere of one of Britten's operas, which was something that kind of astounded all of us. It is kind of unique in so many ways. He originally wrote it for television. It wasn't originally a stage work. And so many of the scenic transformations that happen, you can understand that this was written with the idea of using the medium of television to make it work. Ultimately, a few months after it was done on television, it did have a stage premiere at Covent Garden. So it's certainly more than stage worthy. What also made it tricky to produce prior to this was it was a fairly large orchestration, and there now exists a smaller orchestration. One of Britten's disciples, as it were, I think his name is David Matthews, created an instrumentation for 15 players, which meant it was somewhat similar to Britten's own chamber operas like Turn of the Screw and Albert Herring, except with a much, much larger percussion section. But it also made it more producible. Again, it's an opera with no chorus. There's a small boys chorus who sing just a little bit in it. We were able to get by with...
In other words, a chorus of small boys or a small chorus of boys?
Either way. We got away with using 4 boys. They mostly sang in unison. There's only one part where they were divisi, so we were able to do with just 4 of them. Highly complex piece. Many things I had encountered in Britten that I had never encountered before. And I think even in the early works of Britten, this element doesn't exist as much. But there are certain sections that are somewhat aleatoric, where you let the singers do what they want, and you have to kind of watch and then bring the orchestra back in at a certain point. It's really sort of something I had never quite encountered before. But I said, I have done some musical theater, some Broadway work, and this isn't that far from doing what they call in Broadway a vamp,
Yeah.
where there's dialogue going on and you're playing it, and the orchestra's playing underscoring, and you have to watch the dialogue and then have the orchestra come into the next moment with the singer at the right time. It's not that dissimilar to that concept in a way. It's a tricky subject. It's mostly dealing with Britain's very profound belief in pacifism.
Yeah.
And then about 3/4 of the way into the story, it turns into a ghost story. And some people find that it's two different things, and how does it mesh? And some people find the ending a little unsatisfying. But I think it's a very, very rich work, and there's a lot of things in it that are top drawer Britain, along with anything
I was
else.
very taken with it when I saw it. I was very happy you did it.
I didn't know you made your way out to Brooklyn for that too.
To Brooklyn is not so. I grew up there.
Of course, yeah.
Partially, I'm a mixed marriage, part Brooklyn, part Manhattan. Another British composer, despite the sound of his name, was Gustav Holst.
Yes.
And we know him for The Planets, for his wonderful work, which is played a lot. But you did a double bill that I did not see. The Wandering Scholar and Savitri, is that how it's pronounced?
It's actually just like it's Yenufa, not Yenufa, it's Savitri. So
Savitri.
The stress is on the first syllable, yes.
So what are The Wandering Scholar and Savitri?
Both wonderful works, as different can be. Now, I actually have done Savitri before, so I had some knowledge of it. It to me is a 30-minute little masterpiece that Holst has created. It's based on there was a period of Gustav Holst's life where he was very much into all things Indian.
Yeah.
And so this is based on a story from the Mahabharata, and death appears as in a physical manifestation, as a character, come to take Savitri's husband, Satyavan. And over the course of this 30-minute opera, she is able to convince death to leave her husband alone. So there's a lot of very profound music in it. It's scored for only 12 instruments plus a wordless female chorus. We used 8
wordless,
women.
So just sound. Yeah.
Right. The first time I did it, which was a long time ago in California, the women's chorus sat with the orchestra. They're not characters. When we did this with Little Opera Theater, it was decided that they would appear physically on stage. Philip's concept was to have them be ancestors of Savitri, forerunners. So when they were they often sang with the character of death, and so they would appear with him, not as named characters, of course, but as part of his coterie, as it were. When we did that, we said, well, Savitri's great. It's only a half hour long. We need to pair it with something. We thought of other English operas by other composers. We talked about Riders to the Sea of Vaughan Williams. We talked of The Bear of William Walton. And then we looked into what Holst himself had wrote, and we found this piece that he wrote. It was actually written later than Savitri. A very fun 25-minute comedy, The Wandering Scholar. Interestingly enough, the female role of Allison was one that Renee Fleming had sung in school when she was a student at Potsdam, SUNY Potsdam, which kind of fascinated me. As I say, it's as different can be. It's very raucous and English in the Vaughan Williams-ish kind of vein. I'm surprised it is also not done more often. I'm sure there are other schools that do it occasionally. Again, only 4 characters. And we decided, at one point, the discussion was, well, which should come first and which should come second on the program? Chronologically, in Britain, in Holst's canon, Savitri was composed first. But Philip felt that the message from Savitri was too important, and that the wandering scholar should be the curtain raiser to precede
Hmm.
it. And it
Now,
turned out to be,
could something like Savitri be done on a double bill with Gluck's Orfeo? How would that work? With
possibly.
perhaps Savitri as the curtain raiser, although I don't know Savitri, but because I like to pair operas perhaps on succeeding nights if they're long, that people sometimes we know they go together, like Le Nozze di Figaro and Rosenkavalier.
Right.
But I was saying recently to Brindley Sherritt, in fact, that I like putting together Kovanshina and Lohengrin,
Aha.
or L'Incoronazione di Poppea by Monteverdi with Handel's Agrippina, where some of the same characters appear
Yes.
but differently, because sometimes these works inform and speak to one another. So it not necessarily take Purcell's Dido and Aeneas and put it with Berlioz, but it sounds like this might be interesting to have Savitri with Gluck's Orfeo.
Well, I actually, the first time I did it, it was the curtain raiser for Dido and Aeneas.
Okay.
We actually paired those two together.
Yeah.
And it actually worked quite well. Yeah.
Because this raises a whole issue that I care about, and I know you care about, of programming.
Yes.
Because if I hear one more time opera is not relevant, I don't understand it, doesn't speak to me, which is ridiculous. Sometimes it's the production, sometimes it's the works. And if we put together works in repertory or on a program, sometimes you understand more when you see the contrast and you hear the musical expressions of similar feelings. So it's just one of my, you study Maria Callas in great detail. I'd put together operas that may not seem to belong together, but do.
And you're talking about succeeding nights, or are you talking about one acts paired in the same evening, or both?
It depends. I mean, obviously, something like Kovanshina and Lohengrin, you're not doing on a double bill,
Right.
but you would do them on succeeding nights.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Rosenkavalier and Le Nozze, you could not do on the same night.
No.
If you wanted, you could do a marathon of a matinee and an evening, but you don't have to.
Right. Right.
Because I think, frankly, if you did it that way, it's overwhelming. But if you do it over 2 nights, it's with a conversation in between, it's lived experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we learn more about that. Because I mean, some of these operas you've mentioned, I would love to see right now. You're having explained them more. Another work that you worked on, speaking of vamps, is a musical I love, On Your Toes.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Yes.
That's a whole big vamp. And you worked with Natalia Makarova.
Yes. Yes.
With whom I worked at the Metropolitan Opera. And in a Stravinsky program, but also when American Ballet Theater came in. And she's quite the character. She's wonderful.
Oh, yeah.
She's a magnificent dancer, but also funny and droll, but can play, or not play, can be the high maintenance Russian ballerina.
Yeah.
But she does it with a sense of humor rather than just being onerous about it.
Yes.
And she played this character in Richard Rodgers and Lawrence Hart's, right? With libretto.
Yes. Yeah.
On Your Toes, a wonderful musical with a great big ballet in the middle of it, Slaughter on 10th Avenue, which to me is a masterpiece unto itself.
Yeah.
And was an early example of a Broadway musical with a big ballet in it. But talk about working with Natasha Makarova, which must have been a hoot.
Well, it was a hoot, but it was also very scary for me. I had never really ever conducted ballet before, ever.
Yeah.
Ever. And here I am being thrown in with, a person who some people said was the greatest living dancer of our time.
Right.
So, and I was the associate conductor on that, which meant I've actually played in the pit, but then I finally got the chance to do it with her. But of course, I was just, thrown into it. I did not have a rehearsal myself. And a friend of mine who was something of a ballet fan, she says, well, she sometimes has been very mean to conductors. They said there was one time where she didn't like what the conductor did. She walked to the front of her stage and tapped the rhythm with her toes and did out of character.
Yep. I saw that happen.
Oh, wow. So needless to say, it was one of the scarier moments of my life the first time I did it. And I finished the show, and her personal assistant came to me and says, Natasha wants to see you. And I felt like I was walking to Le Gibet, the scaffold. I thought, well, what's going to happen? I said, okay, swallow hard and go in there. And she says, oh, please, you just did one chord. Can you just hold this a little bit longer? I want to hold the pause. Just hold the chord for me. Oh, I said, okay. She says, but you had the right feeling for this. And I was on cloud nine after that.
Sure.
I mean, I just thought, wow, to be given that kind of testimonial after my very first time with her. And of course, it only got better each time because I knew exactly what she wanted.
But it's a real issue that you alluded to at the very beginning, and when you talk about Porgy and Bess, but which a lot of people don't think about. Conducting ballet and conducting symphonic music and conducting opera are three very different tasks, in my view. Symphonic music has its own structure and rhythm, and opera is about the breath. You could say that ballet or dance is about the pose and the energy and so on, but the coordination is completely different.
Yeah.
And so the starting question is, let's leave out symphonic for now. How do you watch the stage differently as an opera conductor than as a dance conductor?
The thing about ballet or any dance thing, the dancers get it in their body, and it becomes second nature to them, which means you really have to replicate the tempo almost exactly the same every night. You has to be as close as possible. With singers, it's different. Singers can feel, they might feel better, they might feel worse, they might be able to try something different. You can usually hear it with the breath. With dancers, it's in their muscle memory. And you just have to be able to replicate that every time. I was going to tell you an interesting story going back to On Your Toes. Natasha didn't do the 2 matinee performance. We had a younger dancer, Rebecca Wright. She was actually married to George de la Peña, who was the main male dancer in the show.
Right.
And so she did the 2 matinees. There were moments in Slaughter on 10th Avenue where the leading dancer has to do these kicks. And I was told by my boss, who was the main conductor for the piece, that when Natasha did the kicks, I needed to stretch the beat just ever so slightly because she was not 21 anymore and maybe needed a little more time to do those kicks. So stretch that, where I was told the matinee girl, who was a very good dancer and quite young at the time, I didn't need to do that. Keep that in tempo for her, but stretch that beat for Natasha because she needed it. So it's interesting to learn these things.
And did your musicians in the pit know that? Did you have to communicate that, or did they really just have to watch your gesture?
I think I did it in California, and it was back when they had the Los Angeles Civic Light Opera. They had some of the top players in people who were studio musicians, some really A+ kind of people who could respond very, very quickly. I don't think
right. So therefore, it was a gesture. Because what I mean is, for example, at the Met Orchestra with their wonderful musicians, a lot of them would know the opera, of course, but they would also know that Miss So-and-so was singing the role of Leonora tonight and not Miss Other So-and-so, and how she breathed or sang differently from the other one. And they would play, I mean, whoever the conductor was, they would follow the conductor, but within that context, they would listen to the stage. The Met's the orchestra I know best. What I love about them is the degree to which they listen to the stage.
Oh, yeah.
And what that brings to a performance.
Oh, it makes a world of difference.
Yeah.
When you get a real opera orchestra who are in tune with that, it just makes it so much easier. I actually kind of ultimately did experience that with these Porgy and Besses, going back to that, because most of the time we used the same players. They were from Bulgaria, interestingly enough. When we first started the tour, it was way back in 1993. They had just been westernized for a couple years. Dare I say, they were cheap labor at the time. Later on, they started understanding what unions were and started asking for other things. But they had they stuck with us. And I mean, occasionally there were changes in personnel, but the core players stuck with us for years and years, and they knew it like the back of their hand. I mean, they probably didn't even need to open the scores, kind of like Broadway players who have played for say the players who have played Chicago or Phantom of the Opera years, year in and year out. They don't even need to open their books anymore. The score is memorized.
Yeah, but you still want them to. I guess I do. One of the first Porgy and Besses I ever saw was actually in Budapest
Yeah.
in 1976. I was a teenager in blackface,
Oh gosh.
a Hungarian cast singing mostly in Hungarian. So indecipherable. I mean, words like "it ain't necessarily so" or "Bess, you is my woman now." I don't know what they were singing in Hungarian in blackface, and it was scandalous to me, having grown up in America and having known the American version, just because it seemed like a parody of this magnificent work. But
Well,
to them, they were playing it in makeup because they didn't have black artists at that time in Hungary.
I actually had a similar experience to that. One time I did Porgy and Bess in Istanbul, Turkey, not with black singers. They did it. Not. It wasn't staged. It was a concert version. When you do it in a concert version, you can sort of maybe get away with it. So we had an entirely Turkish cast, some of whom spoke English,
Mm-hmm.
and I was brought in. I wasn't the conductor for that, but I was brought in to kind of help them with the music and sort of de facto diction coach, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't easy. You know, you had this old Turkish woman doing Mariah who didn't speak any English. And you know, Mariah has a lot of spoken lines.
Yep. And very fast.
Yeah. And I'll never forget when she had to say, "What's the matter with you, sister? Ain't you know you're going to be late for the picnic?" She, "What's the matter with you, sister? Ain't you know you're going to be late for the picnic?" Something of that nature.
Oh boy. It's kind of like, was it Giulietta Simeonato? Anything you can do, I can do better. I can do anything better than you know I can. Yes, I can. No, you can't. um, Another work, I mean, you really carved a career as a presenter of 20th century opera, an advocate for it, the mother of us all.
Ah, that's the piece I've done the second most often.
Talk
I've
about
done
it, please.
okay.
Its
I was
creators, its genesis, because it's a particular work.
I was really lucky. This was one of the first things I did in New York. There was a production that was done by off-Broadway producers. It was called Music Theater Group. I don't know if you were familiar with them.
No.
The lead producer, Lynn Austin, was personal friends with Virgil Thompson. And so she decided to present it in a scaled down version with a cast
Virgil
of 10.
Thompson being the composer.
Right.
And Gertrude Stein, the librettist.
Yes.
And Virgil Thompson lived in the Chelsea Hotel on 23rd Street and had a notable lifestyle there, let's put it that way.
But I was very lucky because I was brought in as the music director, and I got to spend many sessions at the Chelsea Hotel going through the score with Virgil himself and hearing various, not only anecdotes, but also just directives on how to do this. So I got it from the horse's mouth. I sort of was able to experience that again later on when I did Prince of Players with Carlisle, because I had been planning a trip to Florida to visit my own father who was living there. And I took a side trip to Tallahassee and spent 2 days with Carlisle doing the same thing, going through the opera with the creator. But it was kind of an amazing experience. And I grew up, have a very special fondness for the work. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea because sometimes.
Talk about it, because I know it, but I'd rather you describe it as someone who performed it. What's it about the language?
Well, it's full of Gertrude Stein non sequiturs, and they
Right,
come out of nowhere, and you think,
right.
what does this have to do with it? And the idea is to sort of come up with a way where you distill what is the essence of what she's really talking about and bring it to the forefront. And one thing Virgil said is, textual clarity is paramount, no matter what.
But it's about voting. I don't want, I really am avoiding characterizing because I'd rather you do it.
Okay,
What's
okay.
the story about?
The story is about Susan B. Anthony,
Yes.
and her fight for women's rights, and how she was able to celebrate even small victories that she had.
Mm-hmm.
It's a big moment in the piece when she learns that Congress has stripped the word male, and she takes that took that as a personal victory.
Mm-hmm.
And there are little there are subsidiary characters, some of whom are having romances, but it's really all about the acceptance of the person who is the outsider. I think that
Yes.
is the essence of it all. So it touches.
But they do that subversively. That's what it's about, but it's not what they address, in my view.
Right.
Yeah, and that's part of the magic of the piece.
And some people say, well, but Thompson's music is so simplistic in this. I said, but that's the point. It doesn't get in the way.
Right.
It actually works for what the subject matter is. And I've been real lucky. I've gotten to do it in many different permutations, big cast, small cast. One time I even did it in a cut down 75-minute version with just a cast of 5.
Mm-hmm.
Susan B. Anthony and 4 other soloists who did all the other roles.
Yeah.
And it always seems to affect the audience no matter what. I was especially lucky because in 1983, Virgil Thompson was one of the Kennedy Center honorees that particular year. That was the same year we had done the piece, and somehow our producer, Lynn Austin, was able to work it out. We got to actually perform about 10 minutes on this Kennedy Center Honors program. Yeah.
Wow.
That was
that
pretty
I didn't
exciting.
know.
Yeah.
Speaking of Kennedy Center Honors,
yes,
a very dear friend of ours is the magnificent Martina Arroyo, who recently on February 2nd had a birthday. One of my very favorite people. She was an honoree. And after her career as an active singer, I worked her last show, which was at the Met, was Aida. She created this wonderful foundation that is a prelude to performance. It's about developing for basically 30 young singers every year the skills to perform an opera, rather than, say, focusing on scene study alone or vocalism alone. It's about everything involved in making an opera production. And you in 2019 did Falstaff with them.
Yes.
And talk about, because I forget whether that was the year or the year before that I was teaching there, but talk about the Arroyo Foundation, about working with these young artists, because it too is very special and deserves to be known by more people.
Yeah, and I'm just sad that it sort of has ceased operations, at least at this point.
Because of the pandemic.
I think primarily because of the pandemic. Also, Mark Rucker, who was running the day-to-day operations, is now he and his wife were living in New Jersey, and now they live in Michigan. He teaches
Michigan
there.
State University. Yeah.
And also, Martina herself is less mobile than she had been, and I mean, let's face it, she was the one who could raise the money. And so I think
and also a fabulous teacher.
Wonderful.
In addition to all of her assets and sense of humor and humanity, a teacher in the old school.
Yes.
She went to Hunter College, as did Regina Resnick, and who was also a fabulous teacher. And I think there's something about the kind of educations they received from Hunter College, which, if people don't know, it is part of the City University of New York. It, for a time, was more a school for women. Now it's not, but with a very high standard of education that both of them benefited from in their youth before going on to great careers in opera. But Falstaff, which is not an easy opera either.
No.
It's a masterpiece. It's one of the greatest works, but it ain't easy. And what's it like working on a piece with all of these different roles for young artists, with young artists, um, including a fugue at the end, which, if I remember, has 14 different parts.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
The lucky thing that Martina was able to give us mostly was an adequate amount of time to get it rehearsed. That's the thing that's such an advantage. I mean, they also took a lot of care in casting and in getting the right people for the roles, but we had time to really dig in, make sure every I was dotted, every T was crossed, make sure that people knew exactly what the dramatic motivation was at any time, what they, immersion in the text. All these elements were covered by the various staff members. It really was so comprehensive in getting them prepared that my job was easy, even with a difficult. Now, I wasn't originally supposed to be the conductor for that. It was my
Willie Waters, right?
Willie Waters, and
yeah.
What happened was Willie had a stroke, and Mark Rucker was trying to keep this kind of under wraps at the time. He came in and he said, Willie won't make it for the first week. Can you lead the rehearsals? And I said, well, I have a pretty big background with Falstaff. I had told him that I had been so lucky when I was younger to have played rehearsals for Carlo Maria Giulini when he did the famous production with the LA Philharmonic back in the early 80s.
I worked on that.
In Los Angeles?
I was brought to LA. I did a lot of work in LA. That was my first opera work in LA. Before there was an LA opera, then I was invited. I worked at the Met then, but I was invited to basically leave the Met and move to LA to work at at the new LA Opera.
Yeah.
Peter Hemmings invited me, which I took very seriously, but I also loved my job at the Met, so I didn't leave. But I always had a very nice relationship with LA Opera. It's a wonderful city for opera.
This actually predates LA Opera.
Yes,
when Giulini did it. It was right. It was with the
Renato Brusone, Lucia Valentini, Tedani.
Yeah. So I at least
it was Giulini who invited me to do that. I knew Giulini from Europe. Yeah.
So I felt like I had the credentials for that particular piece. I also was very lucky because when I had worked on the production in Los Angeles, I went into the orchestra pit on breaks and I basically purloined all of his string bowings. And so I have those all marked in my parts. So when I did it with Martina, I told the orchestra, we are using the bowings from Maestro Giulini. But Mark brought me in and said, can you do this first week of rehearsal and we'll see what happens then. And at that point, they were possibly looking for a fancier big name conductor to come in, because I think they knew all along that probably Willie was not going to come back.
Yeah.
But I think I convinced them that I knew the piece pretty well, and I had the vote of confidence of Ian Campbell, who was the stage director. And so it did ultimately fall in my lap. But the support staff was unbelievable. Just the number of people that helped out on this to really make sure everybody was immaculately prepared for this.
Yeah. It's a huge undertaking, and for a foundation to do that, every other so-called young artist program I know does a lot of very good work, but not that.
Yeah.
And I never felt they got the praise and attention they deserved for, over the course of basically 5 or 6 weeks, mounting a professional quality opera production, all with young artists, but with more experienced hands such as yourself and Ian Campbell and Martina behind it. Making it happen. And it was remarkable. But I don't recall, maybe you do or don't, who is your Falstaff and who are your leading ladies?
Oh, I can tell you. The Falstaff, and he's is a younger Latino baritone named Jose Maldonado.
Oh, sure.
He's kind of portly himself in real life, so he kind of is exactly the persona. He's also incredibly charismatic and charming, so he brings that to it. Plus, I have to say, I always love working with Latino singers because they know how to do Italian vowels right.
I like working with portly singers. They know how to do everything right.
The one who has gone on to have something of a career now was the young lady who did Nanetta also a Latina. Her name is Maria Brea,
Sure.
and she's things are happening for her now. We had a really good Ford. His name was Gerardo de la Torre.
hmm
Um, the Alice. I actually just worked with her recently again. A woman from the uh, Uyghur section of China. I don't know if
hmm
you know, named Nina Mutalifu.
hmm
So some of these people, things are starting to happen for them. I
Yeah.
was blessed with some really talented people in that cast. Yeah.
2019, especially with the pandemic in between, is like yesterday
Yeah.
for a
Yeah.
young artist's
Yeah.
career.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So that, yes, we will still be hearing from all these people. Now, Candide, you did in Bergen, Norway. Leonard Bernstein's Candide. Juan Darien, which I saw, the Julie Taymor production. Julie Taymor, I know somewhat. She's most famous for The Lion King, but also Grendel at New York City Opera and The Magic Flute at the Met. Um, but also you did the Los Angeles premiere of Sunday in the Park with George by Stephen
Yes.
Sondheim.
Yes. Yes.
I did not see that production of it unless it was the version that came from New York, which I knew very well. Was it a
It,
new production or basically
Believe
the
it or
New York
not,
one?
it was actually at a college. It was actually at a university.
Okay.
The first LA performances were at a college, Cal State Long Beach, Cal State
hmm
Los Angeles, excuse me. Um, I had substituted for one of the keyboard players in the Broadway production back in '84, so I had some knowledge of the piece.
hmm
Uh, it was a different, the director's concept was a little different, but obviously the posing of the picture at the end of Act One is the same. There were some differences. One of the things,
For people who don't know, it is Stephen Sondheim's extrapolation, I'll use that word, of what's happening to the characters who are in Georges Seurat's um, Afternoon at La Grande Jatte, the very famous painting by Seurat that's in the lyric, not the lyric, the Art Museum, the Art Institute of Chicago. And the second act of the show is about the characters later on and how they evolve. It's a show that I didn't initially love, but now I do. It took me a while to warm up to. I love other Sondheim more, but I've come to really like the show as well. And to me, a little bit of what you described about conducting for ballet dancers is what Act One is like, the end of Act One, because what's happening is that this painting, this that we all know, comes to life, so to speak, as the characters arrive and take their places. And then there's a wonderful coup d'etat at the end of the first act as we see the painting as depicted by the costumer usually, but also by the actors playing the different roles. Even a monkey, there are all these different, and I forget if it's an organ grinder, an ice cream seller, something like that. But it's an astonishing moment. But you, the conductor, have to conduct the movement, I would say, more than the singing because there was not so much singing. Or am I mistaken?
the final number of Act One, no,
Yeah,
it's all sung. It's all
it's
sung.
sung, but to me, it's about choreography.
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
more than
So
about singing.
it's like a great big hymn,
Yeah.
and it has to be. The hard part I remember was people moving slow enough so
hmm
that they don't land in the spots to create the painting until that magical final moment when you actually
Yeah.
are seeing the Seurat painting before your very eyes.
Yeah.
And I think the tricky part was just making sure people didn't, get to their
Take their
spots.
posture
Yeah,
before.
yeah,
Yeah.
too
Yeah.
early, right? Yeah, yeah. Uh, Again, another. I guess I've been very lucky. I've gotten to do some very wonderful pieces, and I consider that among them.
hmm
I always said I wanted to make sure I got to do at least one Sondheim show in this lifetime. And I was very blessed to be able to do that at that time. Yeah.
Now, I could mention, I didn't see it, but it's a work that I love that you did is Mark Blitzstein's Regina that you did in Des Moines, Iowa.
I
Um,
was the cover. I
the
was
cover. Okay.
at that point Robert Larson, who
hmm
had founded the company, and he conducted and staged every production.
Right.
So he was that, but I was his cover, as it were. Yeah.
And that is based on the play The Little Foxes by Lillian Hellman, one of the great American plays. It was recently done in St. Louis with the incomparable Susan Graham, who I wish I saw, and Susanna Phillips, who is a Southerner.
Yes.
And apparently it was just a splendid production. I don't know if you saw it.
No, I wanted to.
But
I knew
when I
people in
think
it.
of
Yeah.
the opera productions, I've seen many. The ones that I've missed, there would have been that among them. Another would have been an opera that never happened, Vanessa by Samuel Barber, starring Maria Callas, for whom he wrote it.
Yes.
So you, as the great Callas expert of our time, what do you think Maria could have done with Vanessa? Ultimately, it was sung by Eleanor Stieber.
Oh, I sort of know the story of this.
Go ahead.
In 1956, when she was here doing her debut, she was here for a couple months. Barber's people approached her, and she and Meneghini drove up to the home that he and Menotti were living in, and spent an afternoon with them.
So
And he
let's get it
played.
clear. Meneghini being Callas's husband, Giancarlo Menotti being not only the librettist, but the life partner then of Samuel Barber.
Right.
Yeah.
They went up there, they spent an afternoon, and he played through the score for her. And I think she may have said, I'll think about it, and ultimately declined it. Many people think the reason she declined it was that she thought that the role of Erica was actually the flashier role and the one that may have been really more suited to her temperament.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it wasn't going to be the lead because the show was called Vanessa.
Right.
And so that, who knows? That could be true. It could be apocryphal. We don't know. But it's not, it seems like it could be a logical reason why she might have turned it down.
So final question. If you could have conducted Maria Callas in any work, whether it's some of the contemporary works you did or many of the classics that you've done, because you've done Handel and Verdi and Mozart and everyone, Rossini, which role would you have conducted Callas in, especially one that perhaps she never did?
Oh, one that I've never done, because I probably may have gravitated toward Macbeth because I got to do at least one performance of that opera.
Yeah. But maybe one that she never did.
One that she never did.
If you could say, Maria, I've got a role for you.
Wow. The trouble is she never did anything past Puccini with in her career, except for that one Greek opera.
But that's why I'm leading you forward. I mean, obviously, I don't think it would have been on your toes.
No, I don't think so. Don't think so.
Or
personality-wise, yeah.
But I mean, you've conducted Threepenny Opera. You've conducted works that we may not think of her in, except that she was a brilliant artist. And, we know her for Tosca and many of the roles that she did. But, for example, maybe one of the crazy ladies in the Mozart three opera seria.
Oh, I always thought she would have been
Vitellia, for example.
Well, but I also think Donna Elvira.
Yes.
Interestingly enough, and this is going back to the trivia contest, because I think this is how I won one of the questions. People forget that when she made that rather strange album of Mozart, Beethoven, and Weber, she did both of Donna Anna's arias and the Donna Elvira aria. And the story behind the Donna Elvira aria is rather interesting. That wasn't originally scheduled to be on that album.
Mm-hmm.
They had recorded everything else, and then the producer of the recording said, we really don't have enough music to fill two sides of an LP. And Rescigno came up with that. You want to read Mitradi? Okay. And she did it. And it's actually, of the Mozart excerpts on the album, certainly the best one that she did.
Yeah, it's thrilling.
And I think the character would have suited her so well.
Yeah.
I think while the aria has its challenges, it doesn't have the tessitura challenges that Donna Anna has.
Mm-hmm.
I think could have been brilliant. Can you imagine somebody doing like that with she and Sutherland together as Donna Anna?
Yes, I was going to say Sutherland. And who do we get as Zerlina? from that era.
Oh, well, you could use the first one that I ever saw, which was no, this is later. My first Zerlina was Mirella Freni, believe it or not.
Okay, sure, why not?
Yeah, and why not?
But Franny would have been 19
She
at
would have been
that
a little
time.
young, yeah, a little young at that
She
point.
could have
Yeah,
done it.
yeah, yeah,
She could have done it.
yeah.
Maybe Roberta Peters in that
Oh
from
yeah,
that era.
yeah.
All right, since we're casting and you're conducting, Maestro, who are the Don and Leporello in your 1958 recording of Don Giovanni?
Well, like I said, I think it has to be Siepi, doesn't it? It kind of
All
has
right.
to be. Kind of has to be.
Yep.
And it depends if he's Leporello. It depends if he's cast it the old school way as a buffo or the newer way as someone who is similar in voice and stature to.
Well, remember, it's a recording. It's not
Okay, so
a stage
so
production.
so it doesn't uh but somebody from that era, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I probably would still go with Giuseppe Taddei.
Yes, I would go with you. That's a very good one.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And Ottavio, Nikolai Geta, maybe?
Uh,
UC Bierling.
unless Fritz Wunderlich was already singing at that point. Maybe that
Okay.
was too. Yeah,
Because we put it 1958 and Bierling died in 1960.
that's right.
So I think we could have UC Bierling.
Yeah,
And who are we missing? Mazzetto and the Commendatore.
Commendatore at
George
that time.
London.
I think you wanted more of a profundo sound for that. So,
All right.
well, you know who I loved, who a lot of people didn't know so well, was William Wilderman.
Yes.
I got
Okay.
to actually work with him on a couple of productions toward the end of his career.
Mm-hmm.
Just loved his sound. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. So Mazzetto we're missing. George London.
Right. How about Rolando Panera? Or something?
Very good. All right. So you're conducting, and finally, what orchestra will you be conducting this cast album
Uh,
for? London, Decca, RCA, Angel, EMI, Philips, whichever label, Sony, Columbia.
you give me the Wiener Philharmoniker, I won't say no.
Okay, very good. Sold. And conducted in the studio in Vienna in June of 1958. How about that?
That sounds great.
Very good.
Yeah.
I look forward to hearing that production. I think with modern technology, we can make it happen.
Yeah.
And you're the one to do it. Richard, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Fred.
I think people learned a lot about you that I knew something of, but not as much as I came to learn today. But very importantly, I think I want people to know that opera is not only the masterpieces we know, but then in recent times and even today, there are masterpieces being produced all the time, but they require the care of people such as yourself to bring them forth as the great works that they are. So keep up the good work.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.